Oh, it says live. All right, hope we're live. Thanks everyone for your patience. We just had some technical problems. Hi, I'm Adriana. Welcome to Blockchain Professionals June 2020. We have George, Samman, James, Zaki, and Jess Oswald on the call. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hi.
All right, why don't we start with some quick introductions and then we move on to George's presentation. George, do you want to intro yourself first?
Yeah, hi, my name is George Samman. Thanks for having me on the show and pretty excited to talk about DAOs. I have been working in the cryptocurrency space since 2012. Basically, I'm an advisor and an investor in projects. I've worked with many projects, so I won't go into the details of that, but I do have a website called semantics.com, which has lots of my work on it and the stuff that I've done in the past, as well as my blog and some of the other stuff, papers I've written and whatnot on different subjects like stablecoins, consensus mechanisms, etc. So yeah, that's who I am.
Excellent. James, how about you go next?
Alrighty, yeah, I've been in the crypto space, mostly on the tech side for the past few years, and working on some different projects in that time, mostly smart contract development. And recently, sort of started looking into more into community currencies, token bonding curves, and token modeling with CAD and things like that. So still on the tech side, but looking forward towards the applications and where they're practical, and obviously DAOs play a part in that. So I'm quite interested in this topic too.
Excellent. Jess.
Hey, how's it going? My name's Jazz. I've been in the crypto space for a couple of years now, working predominantly in the legal side. So I did some work last year and early this year at KWM, working on that kind of stuff. And at the moment I'm at FinTech Australia.
Okay, so as George mentioned, and as you guys know, today it's all about DAOs. George recently wrote a white paper with Daniel Freuden. And in this white paper, he goes very deeply into it. And that's what we're gonna learn today. George, do you wanna kick it off?
Yeah, sure. So I'm trying to explain some of the key takeaways in the report, and then I'll explain some of the key graphics, diagrams in the report as well, because it's very intense and there's a lot in there. So I'm just going to try to keep it fairly high level, and then we can move into specific topics afterwards. So I'll share my screen. Okay, let's see. Can you see my screen now?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so I'll just briefly go through some of these key takeaways. I'm not going to go into all of them in great detail, more just along the lines to get everyone familiar. But first, I should probably start with what a DAO is for people who may or may not know, right? So DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And really what this is a new way of organizing a corporation. So it's a new type of organizational structure that allows for collective management of common goods between multiple parties that can be either economic or non-economic. So what do I mean by that? It means that there could either be a benefit, a profit, or it could be some other type of a DAO that's formed around, say, helping people, donations, et cetera, et cetera. There's all different kinds of DAOs, and we will go into that as we talk through the paper and some of the graphs in there that have all these different things in them. One thing about DAOs, though, is that the rules of operation and the organizational logic is really using blockchain technology. So smart contracts is how a lot of this stuff is built in. It's also new. The other really exciting part of it is that, and really what I've been focusing on lately in a lot of the work I've been doing, is around the decentralized governance piece, which DAOs really go into deeply. And also they're forming new ways of governing and organizing in a different way than before. So what do I exactly mean by that? I mean that when we talk about organizations, like what you want to do is have multiple parties that are able to coordinate. So in the first point, it talks about Costa's theory of the firm, which is a paper that goes back to the 1930s, in which he talks about one of the main things that a firm does is reduce transaction costs through coordinating. And when you can do this, you can innovate within a corporate structure in ways that you haven't been able to do before. So DAOs not only coordinate to reduce transaction costs, but they also coordinate in the way that you can govern them, in the way that you're creating the company itself. Some of the key functions around DAOs, or the key characteristics, I should say, are decentralization, transparency, and these new forms of organizational structure that I was talking about, which we'll go into in a minute. But I must say that it's not only a smart contract that a DAO is. So we talk about things like on-chain versus off-chain. And when you were talking about putting things, the logic and the rules of operation on a smart contract, some of it is done that way, but other things are done off-chain. And again, as I go through this, we'll talk about what the off-chain stuff is, stuff that you don't do through code. So in talking about transparency, you can see here that it says, in order to have a highly functioning DAO, members must have equal access to the same information for decision-making, face the same costs for transacting, and thinking about how they want to be a part of the DAO and participate in a DAO. So while they're basing things on their own self-interest, they also have to base things on what the best interests of the DAO are, because as a member of a DAO, you want to see it do well. So if you are greedy, or if you try and do something to try and hack into a DAO, you're actually hurting yourself as much as everyone else. So DAOs are working on, things around incentivizing, and that's what probably one of the key things is, not only with the governance structure, the corporate structure, but how you can coordinate and incentivize people at the same time to come up with optimal outcomes, so that everyone involved in the DAO is kind of getting something that they want out of it and benefiting from it. So, when we talk about DAOs, we have to also mention probably that the first DAO was actually Bitcoin. And we'll go into the details around how a lot of the DAOs are being built on Ethereum now. And I'll show you a graph around what that means exactly. But essentially, like with Bitcoin, it was the first DAO because it's run without a central authority. You have exchanges and miners and some of the developers who really, work on these things called BIPs, which are Bitcoin improvement proposals. You need consensus from all the network participants in order to make it happen. In Ethereum, you have EIPs, same principle, and you need everyone to come together and agree generally to make changes to the code, or a hard fork or a soft fork of the code. So one of the main things in this paper that we've talked about that we've made is something we've called the Downtension Triangle. And it's kind of like a trilemma, but not really, because there's nothing really impossible about it. It's more about how you can kind of like slide around it and achieve optimal outcomes based on getting to one piece of it versus another in the triangle. And I'll show a diagram of that and then explain it. But it really comes from this book by Albert Hirschman called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. That's what inspired it. And in a DAO, you have exit, which is an individual choice, which means you can come into the DAO and you can leave the DAO at any point in time that you want to. With Malak DAO, they've called this rage quitting, and that means that you can just leave whenever you want, and you get to keep a piece of your investment and anything that may or may not have been invested in with a DAO that you have been associated with. The voice is the governance piece, which is how we are organizing, what's the DAO about, what are we voting on, what's important, what decisions need to be made, who needs to be hired, all of that kind of stuff. And then there's this element of loyalty, which is like the decentralization piece, in the sense that, like, what is the DAO about? What's the ethos of it? Is it based on the principles that people believe in? And in this, particularly in this space, most of the principles that people believe in are around themes of decentralization and transparency, and making new ways, new forms of governance, and basically new economies. And I think James and I will probably chat about that a little bit afterwards. So I can't really talk about DAOs without talking about DeFi, Decentralized Finance, which really is opening up what DAOs can become. And So right now, DeFi is probably the hottest topic in the entire space. And that is allowing for things to be built for financial applications, transactions to happen, ways to organize economically in ways that you haven't been able to in the past, even in blockchain. But as these experiments are becoming reality and people are putting more money into them and pooling capital, new types of capital formation are happening. Also, new ways to transact and transact very fast and transparently are happening. So one of the things is the key linchpin to getting a decentralized autonomous organization is having decentralized finance in peace. Once you have the decentralized finance in peace, you can do things like bypass traditional banking in way and actually using or getting rid of inefficiencies that you've had in traditional banking. So what does that exactly mean? I have it written here. It makes finance trustless, borderless, transparent, accessible, interoperable, and composable. So when I show you a diagram also of the tech stack later, you'll see at the core layer is the smart contract layer, and DAOs and DeFi both exist through these smart contracts. So when you're crossing over the smart contracts of DeFi and DAOs, you're creating a new digital corporation that's never existed before that allows you to do things economically, financially, and from a corporate structure in a totally new way. And we're only at the beginning of that. And you really, in order for DAOs to start to explode, you've really needed the DeFi piece to come into play and actually start to be implementable and useful. And we're at that stage now where there's so many things launching. It's pretty exciting. Also, like you're seeing things, experiments in DeFi where the core business itself is building financial applications, but it's decentralizing and forming DAOs that allow for the governance of the entire project to be community-based. So that means that not only do the core team have a say in the DAO, but everyone who's got a token holder. So really what that means is that, like, for the first time, we're seeing that all invested parties or interested parties have a different voting power that they haven't had before. So it's pretty interesting and exciting. And we're only starting to see those things happen. But another thing to note is that DAOs aren't only looking to bypass or exist outside of the fringe, but in a lot of cases, when they're doing things around profit, investment schemes, et cetera, they need to wrap a legal structure around it. And there's ways to do that now. I will show a diagram of that afterwards that shows how this is being done. So it's marrying in some ways the off-chain with the on-chain, but also the legal world with the digital world. And another thing like that we've talked about is with DAOs is that in a lot of cases, it is a misnomer in the sense that, you know, the name itself makes you think of this thing that exists outside of everything else and kind of runs itself, but that's not exactly true, at least not today. Over time, it probably can become that, but right now it's not. Most DAOs aren't fully decentralized, aren't fully autonomous, and some of them will, most of them want to be, some may not aspire to be, but a lot of the times when you talk to a lot of the projects, they'll tell you that it's training wheels to get to fully decentralized and fully autonomous. You need to have a core developer team in place, and you need these people to kind of steer the project in one way or another to make sure that once you make it fully decentralized, that the right pieces are in place, the vision's there, and then it can work on its own that way. So I think really that's all I'll talk about the key concepts, and I'll just show some of the more interesting charts that I've put together around the different projects. Scroll into that. Okay, so I have this one here, which I think is pretty cool. Yes.
We've got a question from Ryan. He says that if Bitcoin is a DAO, then is any crypto network a DAO irrespective of their governance model?
No, I don't think so. I think the reason why Bitcoin fits that bill is because of the decentralized nature of the project. lots of projects, their governance. In fact, so I should step back and say that for me, I personally think that governance and decentralized governance is really the key to every cryptocurrency project. And what makes something truly decentralized and autonomous is around the governance and how you govern a project. So no, not all of them are. And I don't think that, so that's my answer.
Can I add to that as well? So taking Bitcoin as the example, how does the triangle of tensions apply to it?
Well, I wouldn't, when I get to it, I'll answer that.
Okay, okay. Let's get to
right?
the graphic.
Yeah, right, because I'll go through it and I'll show the different pieces of it. Because Bitcoin has its own technological trilemma around it that's trying to be solved, or maybe not trying to be solved, depending on who you talk to, and the narratives that are in play, right? Like, you know, everything's a narrative in the space, and it changes over time. And, you know, sometimes people want it to be a store of value. Sometimes they want to be able to open it up to do things like have smart contracts on top of it, build it out for DeFi, et cetera. But, you know, right now, I think people are quite happy with it, you know, being something that is non-correlated and some sort of a store of value. So anyway, this is the, this chart really just shows the DAO ecosystem by the different categories. So at the top, you see things like the tech-related developer grants. So these DAOs exist solely to give out grants to developers to build core technology out for different projects, mainly Ethereum-based projects. And you know, in essence, some companies like Synthetics, for example, have their own granting DAO that allows for people to tap into money and you know, create core things for Synthetics. EOS does this as well, and that's actually a DAO-based system as well. Although it's really hard pressed to find. Well, at least I had trouble finding a lot of the DAOs that were working with EOS. So tech developer grants is one, non-tech grants is another one, and those are essentially just around things that you know, give out social grants for social, economic, and community-based activities. Investment DAOs, these are like the Fairmints of the world, the Lao, Meta Cartel, basically allowing you to invest into, it's like a venture capital type of token that allows you to invest into different projects, which, you know, the community votes on which ones will get financed and which ones not. And then you benefit from that if the project's in the same way as a venture capital model works. Then there's decentralized governance, and they're working on things specifically around decentralized governance. So these basically would be considered things like the District OXs of the world, Curve Labs, and there's a few others in there as well, Claros. Up at the top, you have DeFi DAOs. Like I said, these are all DAOs that are working in the DeFi space. Lots of them, the governance is the piece that is truly becoming the DAO piece. Well, and then in effect, that makes the whole project a DAO. A lot of times they'll hand it over to a foundation. Foundation will, you know, have core members stay on for a period of time. And over time, the governance becomes truly decentralized in a lot of these projects. Some of them, it's decentralized right from the start. MakerDAO is an example of a project that was centralized at first and now has moved to a more decentralized model. Protocols and organizations, as opposed to DeFi DAOs, are just different corporations that aren't DeFi that have also built out DAOs, like Gnosis, Perlin. Bancor has actually moved into DeFi recently. When we did this originally, it wasn't exactly a DeFi play like it is now. And then DAO, DSaaS, which is DAO software as a service. Aragon is the key example here, and things like DAO Stack and Commons and Colony. So basically, they make it very easy for a person to spin up their own DAO using their software. You get an ETH name in the case of Aragon, and then you can go and create your own DAO on top of it, building out software. So this is where how onboarding is going to happen in the DAO space. Okay, next is the technology layer of the DAOs. So the first thing is the base layer, which I was talking about before. So all DAOs are built on top of some sort of a base layer. We use Ethereum as an example here, but it's not just Ethereum. There's many other projects, protocols, I should say, that are also building out DAOs like EOS and Decred and there's a fair bit of others. I list them in the report. Tezos is starting to as well. But the point here being is that you have this protocol layer that exists, and then on top of that, you have different projects, different organizations that are building things. So some of them are just straight into simple DAOs, companies that are like Digix, which is winding up right now as we speak. Built a DAO. Aragon, like we said before, is decentralized, is using a DSAS model. And then just different types of DAOs that are being built around the Ethereum environment. James and I worked on this chart here, this graph, and this is really just showing the tech stack itself from the smart contract layer up. So the smart contract layer, you have the membership, voting, fund allocation, those type of things happen at that layer. It's also where the DeFi layer would also happen. So economic transactions of some kind as well. And then it goes up from there to the individual using a front end and dApp browser. Something to note here, back to what I was talking about with BIPs and EIPs. This is really an image around layer 1 versus layer 2 and how you can see where DAOs fit into it. So at the core, you have these economic improvement proposals and for Bitcoin and Ethereum. And those they happen around core consensus mechanism things and other types of votes. That's all at layer 1, and that's where the Ethereum in the other diagram, that's where that sits. And then you have all these things happening at layer 2, plasma, side chain, state channels, sharding, lightning, and that's where DAOs exist as well. Just for a visual perspective of it. Okay, so here's that tension triangle I was talking about coming up. So as you can see here, you have this triangle, and it's kind of a sliding scale around these things, right? So like, you want to manage and coordinate the incentives of all three of these so that you don't get exit, everyone feels they have a voice, and there's a loyalty towards the project. So it's hard, and in a lot of cases, things don't work out. People leave DAOs, they fork a DAO and go create their own DAO because it doesn't, some of the things that happen within it don't meet their original principles, or they can't get in because they don't have enough capital to join that DAO. So they'll use some code from it and build their own that's something similar that meets more their ideals. So up at the top here, I kind of talk about different pieces of this and what it means. So for voice, it's the articulation of discontent with a product, service, or policy position under conditions when exit is not considered a viable option. So exercising your right to say something and to vote really on what you feel and how you feel within a DAO. And everyone who is part of a DAO should be doing this. One of the problems with DAOs is that you see a lot that voting is very down in a lot of them. And I think that's something that needs to be worked on tremendously. Some of them do well, others don't. It's more apathy. People just are apathetic. So it's really around getting the loyalty to a place where people feel that they have a stake and that their vote matters. That still isn't being solved in the digital world, even though it's more democratic, which is super interesting. So when we talk about decentralized governance, we're still really at the very beginning of it and really trying to figure out how we can, get people, get incentives aligned and people activated to do things that they don't do in the real world. So that problem still exists. So, speaking about the loyalty, decentralization is that, and that it's the loyalty to the mission or the policy platform or a firm that makes people want to stay and be a part of it. They feel that, it represents them in some way. And then exit is the most extreme thing that happens, and that's when you can't. It's your voice, and once your voice isn't heard, you exit. So that's the most extreme thing that happens, is that you leave. So that's on the individual level, really. Like individuals decide to leave a DAO, they come into a DAO, they bring their money in, and they take their money out when they're not happy. Okay, so what's next here?
That's like Ethereum Classic.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, you have some hardcore people who think that that is the better blockchain. I won't get into that debate here. I know there's a lot of people that will be enraged by that subject, and we'll leave that for a different time. But yes, exactly right. And like Malak DAO, for example, that's one of the bigger DAOs, and it's very expensive to join and very exclusive. You have to basically know somebody and or be someone very prominent in the space with a big amount of capital. But the DAO itself is something that people really like, the code that it's built on top of. So there's lots of projects that are using Malak DAO. They're forking it and building their own DAO off of it. But they can't be a part of that DAO because they don't meet criteria, or they're not, or they just can't get in. So yeah, I mean, we're seeing all sorts of different things happening that are interesting.
In respect of voting, I remember, for example, when EOS first launched, there was heaps of hype around it, but then even then after launch, voting was, I noticed at least, quite low, like percentage-wise across the users. So it's really interesting to kind of hear that that is still an issue among DAOs. Are you seeing any sort of, or do you think that there's any sort of solution in the market already, or can you see some kind of incentive that could improve that?
So I'll say that, like, if you look at Cosmos and Tezos, they actually have very high voter turnout. So I think a lot of it has to do with staking models and what we're starting to see there, and how I think like economically aligning incentives is probably something that people are looking at. Of course, the problem with that is that it could lead to bribery and plutocracy and lots of other things. So you need to balance it out. Like I've done some work on decentralized governance, and like one thing that, just back to EOS for a second, and I'm not picking on EOS here, but I will just use it as an example, is minus the DAO piece, there's a lot of people who will tell you that EOS, well, it's highly centralized. There's like, I don't know, 20 nodes that vote on everything, and there has been chatter of collusion in many cases around that. And obviously those nodes are whales, basically. Like they're big money, and they kind of just control everything from the standpoint. And there's lots of other projects that are very, very similar to that, even worse. So I'm not picking on EOS. But decentralizing is also hard, because then you have too many voices out there. And some people who, sometimes it's the people that have the least skin in the game that make the most noise, and you need to coordinate and manage that as well. So I think like one thing you can do is make it so that there's coin voting, which means that those who have the biggest stake get a more weight of vote, but also make it such that transactionally, like those who are using the DAO or working on the DAO also have an equal weight in the voting as well. And I did some work in decentralized governance, writing out some governance for a project, and that's exactly what we did. We balanced out coin voting with work, basically, or the people who use it the most should also be able to benefit from voting as well, as not just whales. But again, it's still going to always kind of skew towards those with the money and skin in the game, just because that's just the way human nature is in general. However, you can do things. The thing is to mitigate it as much as possible. And I think, like, again, we need to do more experimenting around that. Like DAOstack uses something called holographic consensus, which kind of leads to a global optimal outcome based on how it works is pretty much like like I said before, there's so much noise out there. You can't expect everyone to vote, everyone to be available to vote when key things need to be voted on. But you kind of get like a consensus around what people want. And then you kind of get these like local consensuses, and you get a feel for what the majority kind of would go for. And then you make this like kind of global optimum outcome out of that based off of like local polling almost is what it would be. So that's interesting as well. But
to
again,
add to that one, I was just going to add one more to that, George. There's also conviction voting, which has been looked at in the common stack. Yeah, which is like the.
You want to talk about what that is? It's in the paper, but I'm happy for you to chat about it now since.
Okay.
You know,
yeah, just the key mechanism I find interesting is that it allows people who may not have a large amount of money to be voting frequently. So for an issue they're very passionate about, they might be turning up each time and voting accordingly, voting consistently. And that will have a greater weight to it because it's been applied over time. Whereas if a whale comes last minute and wants to throw a vote a certain way, they are going to struggle to fight against those who have been consistently voting the whole time. So it sort of reduces the effect of a whale throwing their weight against.
Yeah. And I mean, there's other models out there too that are being experimented with, like prediction markets and optimal and preferential outcomes. So those are interesting models as well. People are looking at those, how you can have a list of preferences and then allow for the people to vote on what they prefer, and then the people, as many people come in and you get your preferences to a certain level, then that becomes kind of like a global outcome. Using prediction markets as well is super interesting, and these things are all starting to be experimented with now. Like not only are we in the early days of like decentralizing organizations and finance, but this governance piece is coming together as well. And it's just a really interesting time in experimentation in all of them. So this, I won't really go into this too much, but this is kind of like back to what we were talking about the different things that people do within like the different components of the triangle and what that means. Like, so decentralization is defining what goes on chain and what's off chain and why, an organizational structure and a legal framework for the off chain and commercial operations. So just stuff around the purpose, the member joining criteria and all that. The individual stuff is around decision-making, changing the rules, rage quitting, voting and participation, talked about a lot of stuff, how you stop malicious actors, gaming and hacking the system, how you stop people. Another problem with voting too is that depending on how the DAO set up, you can game votes. Like you can buy them right before a key vote's going to come, and people are starting to do things around time locking so that you can't buy votes at a certain time. You can't buy tokens that allow you to vote at a certain time or before a certain time and after a certain time, so that you can't change the outcome of certain types of votes and stuff like that. Stuff like that. And then the governance piece is just all these different things here. We don't really need to go in that. We've been talking about the governance now and just like what that means. I mean, how you hire staff, how do you break up a DAO? Like, how do funds get distributed? How do dividends get distributed? How much gets distributed? What is it? Is it LLC? Is it a not-for-profit? How do we let members in? All that kind of stuff happens at that level. And then what's here? I won't go into this really. This is just around how MakerDAO governance came in when Maker had that major problem in March. It's a little bit out of the scope of what we're talking about now, and I just won't go in that direction. Otherwise, we can go down to a DeFi route instead of a DAO route. So then there's this concept here, which is around the Lao. I think that's coming up now, that chart. Sorry. Yeah, this. So this is what I was talking about before, is that like, this is actually a chart that I got from the Lao themselves, and this explains what they're trying to do here. So, obviously when you want to do things around financial applications, investing, funds, pooling insurance, making profit, generally there are regulations that falls under, particularly in some of these things. So the LAO has allowed for, which is based off of Open Law Project, which is a consensus project, allows for some of these DAOs that want to do it and need to do it because they need accredited investors or whatever the cause might be, to get this legal wrapper, which makes them an LLC. In most cases, it's a limited liability corporation in Delaware. I think this is basically something that's starting in the US and might be unleashed globally. But it's a very specific application, and it's based on who wants to be regulated and how. A lot of DAOs don't need this because they're not dealing with currency, fiat currency, or there is no regulation around what they're trying to do from a DAO standpoint and from a DeFi standpoint. Like lots of the DeFi projects do not have any kind of legal wrapper around them at this point in time, for example. And then over here is just like code-based projects which don't need the legal wrapper at all, like the blockchain protocols like Bitcoin and Ethereum. They've been blessed by government bodies that they're fully decentralized enough, decentralized dApps like MakerDAO, again, DeFi pieces, and then these grant-giving DAOs, which are basically not for profit. So that's really like some of the innovations coming in this way as well now too, that's allowing for, legal blessing of some of the DAOs that need it. And I think like I'll just stop right there for now, and we can kind of open up the conversation to talk about whatever you guys want.
Awesome. And yeah, I'm not sure if there are any pending questions from the audience.
George, do you want to unshare your screen so we can just look at each other as we talk now?
Oh, yes, that's a good idea. Oh, I will do something.
I can always pull something up back here as well.
Yeah.
I will just put this here. Like if there's any questions, you can email me, follow me on Twitter, go to my website, LinkedIn, whatever you want. Happy to chat about this stuff in more detail and discuss some of the stuff that I've been working on and how it can apply to what anyone might be working on out there. So okay, now I'll unshare my screen and how do I do this again? All right.
I will add all of those details to the meetup as well, post today.
Okay, cool. Stop share. Okay, cool.
All right.
Awesome. So yeah, I'm not sure if there was any questions already from the audience, but I was going to start with a softer one first around I guess just looking at the interaction for an individual. So today they might not be having this kind of voice within their company, but now let's say the company decides to adopt a DAO, they'll have their app or their wallet or their web browser. They then can vote on things. So there's that sort of interaction piece there. How are they going to see the effect back to them? Are there going to be any other signals outside of just maybe seeing the results at some point in the future, or is there going to be more feedback that they get by engaging in this process?
I think it's probably a combination of both. But what I would say is that I think like economic skin in the game always aligns incentives and in a way that you can't get really in any other way. So in order to I think like this should help from a voting perspective and a participation perspective over time. The one good thing about DAOs as they exist now, for the most part, is that you could really participate in them without having a lot of money. And you can, and you have never been able to do that before. Like mostly the individuals left out of like something at a seed level like this because they don't have money, they don't have inside information to get a deal, or they're not an accredited investor and all that kind of stuff. So in some ways, this is superseding that and allowing for individuals to invest in things that venture capital funds can't even invest in because it doesn't fit their mandate right now, right? So I think like as you get people to actually be able to hold tokens in a project be parts of these projects, either by investing in them or actually participating in them, because you don't have to participate, right? It's up to you if you want to. Most of the time they want people who are going to also participate to be a part of the DAO itself. But I think that should in itself be enough to start, at least to get people to have an interest level that they didn't have before. It's like, if you own Ethereum, you'll watch the price a little bit more, right? You'll be interested in what's happening there a little bit more than, say, if you don't. So always for me, having some skin in the game, it makes it, you just want to know what's going on and see how you can help in different ways.
Great. I was, again, at any time, Jazz or Adriana, jump in with the questions. Yeah, so you have to forgive the background noise as well. So yeah, in your paper, you quote at the beginning Mancor Olson's 1987 quote around diseconomies of scale and development, saying that a dramatic improvement in the efficiency of resource use will arise when revenues historically engrossed by governments come to be controlled instead by persons of genuine talent. And I was wondering that what if you had just a kind of like a, someone who's very talented, but it's actually a small group that has a larger say in this. So kind of trying to tease out the types of people that can interact with the DAO. But if we're saying that maybe it's the interaction with the talented ones, is there going to be something more of an incentive for them, or they're going to have better knowledge with their interaction versus someone who's maybe not as talented in that domain?
Yeah, so I mean, it's an interesting one. Really, right now, DAOs are made up of technocrats for the most part. Like, in order to even participate in a DAO, you have to understand cryptocurrency, be involved in cryptocurrency probably, and then be a part of the community in some way where you can contribute something, whether it be tokens or your talents. And those are all niches within themselves. So, I mean, for me, I guess in saying that, it's still super early and super elite and selective even now, even though we're talking about like, something that seemed, like I said before, even though I said before that, people are able to get in with very little economic value, like you haven't been able to, it's still only people who are in this space and understand it for now. It hasn't opened up to the general public yet by any stretch of the imagination. Now, over time, if the model that is being built out is efficient, reduces transaction costs, is more transparent, is cheaper in a lot of ways, and allows for economic participation and benefit for people in a way that they haven't had before, it will, become more mainstream over time. But we're still, in the build out phase of it. But I do truly believe that, we are on the cusp of seeing something evolutionary happen within corporations, within finance, and obviously, cryptocurrency is at the spearhead of that.
Yeah, and just when you mentioned sort of the evolutionary part of it, and the way people can exit and rage quit and do all these things, is there some, I guess, inefficiencies coming back into it? Whereas maybe a traditional top-down corporate structure has some efficiencies baked in because it's very much do as I say down the chain. But if we've introduced this feedback mechanism, it says it could become more efficient, but the first thing you might see is less efficiency because there's more discussion or more forking of people. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think so. Again, it's trade-offs, and you need to kind of work through those things in the early days to get to an optimal outcome or optimal level for those kind of things. But with decentralization should come the ability to leave and come and go as you please, build something based off of something else, taking the code, forking it, and all that kind of stuff. Doesn't make what it does, I think, from a corporation standpoint that's new, is it gets rid of vendor lock-in. With most corporations, once you start using Google or Facebook or something, you're locked into just that, and you have no way of like using a different product or building out a different product off of the Google features. Like, you'll get sued or whatever. In open source land, for the most part, you take something, you build something better, you build a piece that's ancillary to it, or something that helps to improve the base layer or a different layer. And I think for me, in a lot of ways, I don't know that from an economic standpoint, if decentralization is going to lead to as many $100 billion companies or not, but it's going to lead to many different small companies where people are participating in them because they believe in what that does. It's a belief system and an economic system that has its own currency attached to it. So in my view, the world itself, not just technology, but globally on a nation state level, we're seeing decentralization play out all over the place, where there's groups that are breaking out, like whether it's in Spain or in many other countries. And even in the US, you're starting to hear about red states versus blue states, kind of like different states wanting to maybe secede or just like become their own economic zones, special economic zones. And you're seeing this all over the place. I think that that's a theme that starts at the political level and works its way down to the technology level. And this is how it's being expressed, is through decentralizing finance, decentralizing organizations, and it fits within one of the biggest themes we're seeing in the world right now. So for me, I think people want to interact on a more local level. Like, people are talking about bringing their supply chains more home to be more local than they've been because of security threats, or eat more locally, or do things more on a local level. But the beauty about blockchain is that you can do things locally, but be digitally, geographically dispersed, but digitally all in the same place, because you believe in the project, or you believe in the ethos of something, and you can build your own corporation. It's just a different type of local.
I have a question. On the DAOs and the decentralized finance part of your paper, you mentioned I quote, "A worker's primary asset is their capacity to work and earn money. In the context of work, the employer can use the worker as collateral, yet the worker cannot use themselves as collateral. The collateral question is the financial version of class. In DAO plus DeFi compositions, all agents can issue assets to be used as collateral." Does that mean like people can collateralize their own time and use that to finance themselves? How does that?
Well, that's one aspect to it, and that actually is happening now. People have their own personal tokens, and people are investing into people. They invest into the future of that person and their output in society and their output economically, and they own a piece of it.
The founder of this meetup has done that, Ruben Bremenathan, with whom you know.
Yes.
Yes.
Has he? Oh, he has. He has.
Yes, he has. Lawyer now based in San Fran. He has collateralized his own time.
Yeah, exactly. So we're seeing, that's exactly right. That's one aspect to it. Another aspect to it is the DeFi component as well, which is, obviously, like I said before, a key element to decentralized autonomous organizations. But even more important, when you collateralize yourself in the cryptocurrency world, you get paid in things like DAI, Tether, Ethereum, and it all comes through different pipes. And these are all interesting experiments that have just literally spawned up in the last year.
Lots of disruption in the accounting industry there.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I've got a question just going back to DeFi. So you've suggested that at least some DAOs have an inherent link to DeFi. Would you consider that for at least those DAO models, or maybe DAO models broadly, for them to see real success in the future and large scale adoption, would you consider that the success of DeFi would also have to happen?
Yeah, I think so. if you're going to have a digital corporation that's run on smart contracts, you're going to need to have a digital financial component to that as well to make it uber efficient, in my opinion. If you need to move on-chain, off-chain financially from a corporate standpoint, it's going to be a lot of friction and really going to make it really hard, in my opinion, to become to move into something that is organizationally different than what we have today. So I think that in a lot of ways they're hand in hand.
Okay.
Yeah.
So would you consider it not to be enough that, for example, if a bank like in Australia, one of the big four offers something at NPP speeds or something like that, or would it have to be a truly decentralized solution?
Well, so that's interesting that you bring that up. So, you know, you have all these different countries that want to build their own CBDCs, you know, that are digital versions of fiat money. You have NPP, which is just, you know, digital rails for banking. One of the things, though, about that is, and you know, for better or for worse, I'm not going to get into the arguments of this or not. It's the AML KYC piece that will make it less efficient and harder for capital formations to happen, and also value capture to happen in a lot of ways. Right now, the way this is setting up is that you can do all these things from a DeFi perspective without really having to do any kind of AML KYC. You can lock up Ethereum into DAI, you know, get an interest rate off of it, do synthetic assets using synthetics, et cetera, et cetera. You know, there's so many different things that are happening, and it all just comes from owning one token of Ethereum or some other token, and then building out an account of financial products, a suite. And what's amazing about that is that once you can do that, you then, you know, from a corporation standpoint, your digital ledger for deploying capital is probably, you'll never see anything as fast and probably transparent as well, without having to give up AML KYC information. But I mean, I'm not going to get into that. That's a different topic, and you know, other people can debate that. But yeah, I think that's probably the core thing. I mean, from a speed standpoint, MPP is perfectly fine. And I think over time, you'll probably will see things where there is an interaction of cryptocurrency with digital assets that are not crypto, but stable coins of some kind, or digitally backed fiat coins as well. You know, obviously there are some that exist, but those are more from a governmental standpoint.
I'm not sure if we got time for more, Adriana.
We can run a little bit later because we started about 10 minutes late. Okay, one question from YouTube. Alistair asks, are there many securitization projects using DAOs?
Are there many? There's not many yet. There's a few that are starting to. What exactly is he talking? What kind of securitization?
He didn't specify.
Okay. Just thinking of the examples of what Fairmint is doing, they're sort of making it very easy for people to do that. And I think that's, George, you can fill in if that's specific to the US, that they're structuring their thing under the US securities law. So if you're going under that model, you can use their thing and create your business as such.
I believe they're actually using the LAO to do it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in that point of view, I guess if it's like when I see what they're doing, I think, oh, that's many. But I guess in the grand scheme of things, it's you know, wouldn't compare to what's out there. But I'm just seeing all the mechanisms getting into place and getting better and getting more organized on all the DeFi level and legal level to make these things come out like the like the startup communities I was seeing around. Yeah.
Also, one more question. David Jackson asks, will DeFi start to build across lots of other chains? And if not, why?
Yeah. So, for example, Aragon is building on Ethereum and also on Cosmos, I believe. I think it's Cosmos or no, yeah, I think it's Cosmos, but there are, I can't remember, but yes, projects are definitely starting to build on different chains, not just one chain. A lot of it has to do with mitigating risks around the upgrade of Ethereum, and if it doesn't work out the way that it's supposed to. That's a bigger discussion as well. But I mean, phase 0 is starting soon, moving to staking. Everything seems to be going fairly well, if not slower than people want, but really it's around just mitigating risks around one chain and that chain not being able to perform or do what it's promised to do. But yet in saying that, still most projects are built on top of Ethereum in one way or another.
I had a question just on the capital formation piece again, and the way, you know, Fairmint with its crowdfunding, they've got a lock-in for the early investors. So those who come in early have to, like, they're effectively locked in. They've got skin in the game, and they are it's their own self-interest to make sure the project succeeds in the long run. For Common Stack, for the crowdfunding of the Commons, they have like what's called a trusted seed. So again, those early people to have good morals, good ethics, and have that as the initial cohort of voting token holders. So this kind of, I guess, bootstrapping or kind of like having the training wheels on or getting these aligned people, how would you see that, like other forms of that working, and do you see that as essential for all types?
I think it's a good model to try and get good governance and in from the beginning. But the thing is, even when you think people will do one thing, they tend to do another thing as well. So it is hard, but trying to curate as much as you can so that you get the right type of people that you think will help to build something out that's really great and have aligned interests is pretty important, I'd say. Obviously, that makes the decentralization piece early on a little bit harder, but you know, and you'll hear arguments from people that you need to start fully decentralized from the beginning. You can't really go from 0 to 1. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I can see some of the merits in that. I think it's important though that you have people that are aligned. So that's a good way to do it.
Awesome. Another question. Where is it here? DAOs. Oh yeah, and then in the case of when you have DAOs, we were saying that, you know, whales might be limited in throwing their weight around, and if we're not doing KYC for some of these, do you see much concern around Sybil attacks, or does that kind of entirely throw the DAO out if people sense that something's not quite right with the participants?
Yeah, I mean, I've had this discussion before with different founders of DAOs, and they seem to think rage quitting solves for a lot of this. I'm not so sure of that, but I think rage quitting does help to a degree. You know, people just leave with their funds when they're not interested, and they can only access their funds. They can't access any other funds. To a degree, that's something that people in the DAO space have been saying works fairly well enough. I'm more concerned around vote buying and corruption through that system, like through the governance perspective, like how you sway people to vote one way or another, rather than with coin voting and having too much funds and weight to throw around. So I think that's really where the focus we're talking about, and the people doing the right thing within the DAO.
I think it's Adriana, you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, yeah.
My connection is unstable.
Yeah, it just we got a little glitch there for a second. All right, James, Jess, do you have any other questions before we end the call?
We've got one more question from the chat. Got time for that? So Faison said, what are the possibilities that banks in Australia could adopt blockchain for reasons other than financial? And they gave an example of storing digital identity for account creation.
Possible. I think there's banks that are working with blockchain technology. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. It looked like it was unstable again. There are plenty of banks that are working with blockchain technology for different applications that are not necessarily financial. So identity is definitely something that people talk about a lot and is necessary. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't really know what's happening in the banking, what banks are working on, but most of it is definitely done on like private distributed ledgers. And I think that like using public types of blockchains, which is what the focus of this discussion really has been about, is maybe a little bit more of a stretch at this point in time for most corporations and particularly banks. But there are some that are working, with the public blockchain as well. I can't remember. There's been a few projects. I just can't remember off the top of my head which ones that have been working with public versions, putting bonds on top of it or something like that, on top of Ethereum. I can't remember. Yeah. So it's possible.
I think concluding question I had in the questions here was, what do you see as sort of the ideal future with DAOs, and what are the stepping stones or applications we need, and across what period of time do you think we might see those?
What was the first part of it? Sorry.
What might be the ideal future? What would the future look like in the ideal scenario of us using DAOs well, and what sort of applications are needed across what period of time to get there?
Yeah, I mean, so you always think something's going one way, and then kind of when these things start to happen, new things start to form that we never even thought would happen. And I always tend to think that that's the case, particularly with something so new and so with the potential to be so innovative. But I don't know that we're going to get rid of existing corporate structures ever. But I think you'll probably start to see, particularly now, I mean, like, look what's happened with like COVID and the economy. I think like spinning up a corporation for cheap, it's never been cheaper using like the power of DAOs and things like Aragon DAO Stack to build a corporation from scratch, and then to get people to come and seed it and stuff. So I don't want to look too long term. I just want to see more adoption of the technology itself. But I think like I said before, I think one of my big themes for the 2020s is decentralization across all spectrums. And I think like what we'll see is more and more adoption of things that allow for that, and allow for capital formation in a decentralized fashion. So
yeah, awesome.
I'd say the trajectory is probably onwards and upwards for most of this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too, and I guess putting my tech hat back on, that I really like the fact that the analysis tools for these things are ramping up as well, like with CAD and the way they model things, and both the agents and the dynamics. Like, yeah, once there's more data, more applications, then more analysis, it's only going to get quicker. Yeah. It's really exciting times.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Thank you so much, George.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone for participating.
Absolutely. Thanks, James and Jess as well. And for everyone who watched, thank you for being here. Tell your friends, this will be live. Will be online forever. And I will put links to George's white paper and contact details on the show description.
Thank you.
Everyone, have a good one. You guys.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.
See ya.